Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I am finally getting around to putting up a presentation that I've had planned for a long time, but I never got around to it. And to be honest, my opinions on this particular subject have actually wavered a bit back and forth, and I would certainly say that not everything that I could have decided about this is decided. But nonetheless, I thought it would be worthwhile to at least put up the information and have a little bit of fun with it. The topic is Codex Sinaiticus. It's one of the great unsealed manuscripts. Most people who know a little bit about textual critical issues, especially with the New Testament, know about Codex Sinaiticus. And it also comes alongside Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus, and the other major unsealed manuscripts. Now, what we're going to be talking about here is going to be a little bit of everything. We're going to talk about a little bit of the history of the manuscript, its form, what it actually looks like, the errata, the errors that are in it, and then also its overall significance. And like I said, I haven't come to absolutely dogmatic opinions on a lot of this. I'll just kind of be running through my thoughts on it and different things like that. And so it's mostly just I'm putting it out there for general information. And hopefully people will be able to get something out of it. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, one of the funniest things I looked at, this is quite a while back now, but I was looking through YouTube, as I do from time to time, which is a dangerous thing. And one of the captions I read on one of the videos said that the earliest Bibles never used God or Christ. They never mentioned Jesus. They never mentioned God, and it was put out, I believe, by a Muslim group, if I'm not mistaken, basically claiming that Christians added things to the Bible later on. And what's funny about this is that technically they're actually right, and that's because Codex Sinaiticus, along with a lot of the early manuscripts and even a lot of later ones, use what is called nomina sacra. Nomina sacra is essentially abbreviations for sacred names. Of course, it wasn't just sacred names, it was also just common names that would also be abbreviated as well. But some of the abbreviation included the Greek words for God, the Greek word for Lord, the Greek word for Jesus, for Christ, and also Greek word for the Spirit. They were abbreviated basically to their first letter and last letter. Sometimes they had a middle letter in there as well, but usually first and last, and then you'd put a little line over it to say that it's being abbreviated. And the last letter could change depending on the case of the word, whether it was genitive, accusative, dative, nominative, so on and so forth. And it was usually with nouns, and so those are the four major cases in Greek. And so, as I have up on the screen, the way that these look would be something like this. God, instead of being written out as theos, would just be abbreviated to theta and sigma. Lord, Kyrios, instead of being actually written out as Kyrios, would just be kappa and sigma. Jesus would be iota sigma instead of Jesus. Christ, instead of being written out as Christos, would be chi and sigma, as long as it's in the nominative, but if you change to another case, the last letter will change. And then Spirit is pneuma, and that one actually does have one of the middle letters in it. But this is basically how they look. You'd have the abbreviated form with a little line on top. And actually, a lot of times, the little line that you'd have actually in the text is actually is shorter than these lines. I'm just doing this to make it fairly obvious. But a lot of times, the lines would actually be a little bit shorter. And this actually brings us to an interesting point of clarification. The Jehovah's Witnesses are very adamant in saying that Jesus is not God, that Jesus is not Jehovah. Of course, technically, Jehovah is actually a mispronunciation, and you could get into all that. And for the sake of argument, it really doesn't matter that much as far as whether or not the Jehovah's Witnesses are correct about Christ. In that when you look through the ancient biblical manuscripts, a lot of them were written in Greek through and through, not just the New Testament, but a lot of the ancient Christians used their Old Testament in Greek as well, because that was the common language of the time. And so that's what they're going to use. And so for the early Christians, when their conception of Christ was, of course, framed within the context of the entire Bible. And what's interesting is the same way that Jesus is described in the New Testament in the Greek is actually the same way that the Lord, which the Jehovah's Witnesses would call Jehovah, in the Old Testament was described. On the screen right now, on the left-hand side, I have a quotation from Codex Sinaiticus that comes right out of 1 Corinthians 9:1, and it describes Jesus as Iesun ton Kyrion. It basically describes him as the Lord. And this is the same kind of verbiage that's used in the Old Testament in the exact same document. The Lord Jehovah, for Jehovah's Witnesses, a lot of biblical scholars would say Yahweh in the Old Testament. In the Greek is described basically the same way, and I have a quotation from Psalm 18:8, and this is in the Septuagint, so the verse numeration is a little bit different. So it's 18:8 as it appears in the Septuagint, and it says regarding Jehovah, regarding Yahweh, tu Kyriou, which is just an inflected form of the same thing. And also below it references Kyriou. Kyriou. It's the exact same thing. So for early Christians, when it came to what was their conception of Jesus as Lord, they recognized that it was the same Lord from the Old Testament, and they would not have seen any distinction in it whatsoever. They considered Jesus to be fully God. And frankly, we always have. And you can make that argument from the Hebrew text too. In fact, most of the modern scholars do make it from the Hebrew text because the Hebrew text is generally considered more authoritative. However, it works just as easily with the Greek Old Testament, and in some ways even more easily because it's the same words. But that's just an interesting side note, and not really here nor there, and groups will come up with arguments for and against it. But I just wanted to point it out because there is a definite connection there, and it's a very easy connection to see if you're aware of what's going on. All right, so let's also talk a little bit about a particular word in Greek that has caused us a lot of grief over the years. Let's read some of these quotations that we have up on the screen here. Let's start in the upper right, Matthew 16:18. Most of us are pretty familiar with this one. And I say unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Most people are pretty familiar with that verse. This is where Christ institutes his church. Or at least that's how it's been very commonly interpreted, especially by the Catholic Church. Now, what's interesting is that if we read later on in the New Testament, Acts 19:32, we get another interesting thing, and something doesn't quite seem right there. Now some cried one thing, some another, for the church was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they'd come together. If you read the rest of the context there in Acts chapter 19, you'll see that this thing that's called a church is actually a mob of people that have gathered together in opposition to Paul. And it is described as a church, or at least it might. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but think about that for a few seconds. Is this the way that we would normally conceive of church? What's interesting is that in the Old Testament actually uses the same word, however, you hardly ever notice it there, unless you're actually reading from a Greek text. Psalm 25, 4-5, and this is in the Septuagint, reads as follows. I have not sat with the council of vanity, neither will I go in with transgressors. I have hated the church of evildoers, and I will not sit with the ungodly. Church of evildoers. That's kind of interesting. All of these texts actually have the exact same word in the Greek. And let's just take a look at Codex Sinaiticus to see these. So there are the three different passages from Codex Sinaiticus, and I've put in a red box the key word here, and it's ecclesia. Now, it's different inflected forms of it. In Acts 19:32, it's just ecclesia, but in Psalms and in Matthew, it's ecclesia, and it's just a different inflected form of the same word. But what's very obvious from the first part is if you translate it as church in all of the places where it's used, it doesn't make a lick of sense. That is, we wouldn't say that a group of evildoers is a church, and we certainly wouldn't say that a mob which is opposing the Apostle Paul is a church, but the Greek text uses the same word for all three scenarios. And it becomes very obvious when you're reading the Greek that it doesn't mean what it got interpreted to be later on. That is, later on it was interpreted to be a particular institution that Christ erected. However, when you see it in context like this, it becomes pretty clear that it's just simply a common word that means a gathering, and specifically a gathering of people, a group or an assembly. And by the way, for those of you who are also, like myself, a part of the Assemblies of God, this is actually where we get our name in part. That is, ecclesia is the Greek word for an assembly, and that's where the Assemblies of God gets our name from. And yes, we still talk about ourselves as the church and all that, and we use translations that use the translation church. That's not necessarily the problem. The question is, what does it actually mean? Do we translate it like the high churches do and understand it to be a particular institution that was erected, or do we just recognize that it's a group, and it's a group of people, not necessarily a building or an institution? So here's how the same quotations but translated more generally, that is, using a translation of the word that works in all cases because it's the same word in every case. The psalm would be translated as follows: I have not sat with the counsel of vanity, neither will I go in with transgressors. I have hated the group of evildoers, and will not sit with the ungodly. Matthew 16:18 would read as follows: And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my group, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now some cried out one thing, and some another, for the group was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. That's a little bit better, and a little bit more appropriate across the board. It's just an interesting point, though, that word has shifted in meaning over the years, and the high churches, the traditional churches, have really taken advantage of that shift. But originally it didn't quite mean what a lot of people today think that it meant. Now, let's talk about the history a little bit. The first thing that I would like to note about Codex Sinaiticus is that it was an incredibly expensive codex to produce. It was written around 350 AD. It's hard to be super specific, but it's somewhere in that time frame, somewhere in the 4th century. And it was made of vellum, that is basically leather, animal skin. And its ink that it was used was also a somewhat rare ink. And also, of course, you had to pay the scribes for their time and expertise. And here I have a picture of the process of making leather that would be suitable for bookbinding, which is basically the same kind of quality that you would need for Codex Sinaiticus. And the sheets that are pictured that you see in the picture would be enough for a couple of folios, and Codex Sinaiticus had over 700 folios, basically 700 leaves or so. And so if you, even on the highest side, estimate that maybe you could get 10 of those skins from a single animal, maybe a large cow or something, which would probably be a bit of an overestimate as much as you could get, that would still mean that you're killing 70 animals in order to make this thing, and so that's going to get expensive pretty quickly. And then of course, like I said, that doesn't take into account the cost of the ink, and it doesn't take into account the cost of actually having the scribe write all these things out. So very easily it would be over a person's yearly wage at the time. So definitely a very expensive venture, not a venture that you would undertake lightly at all. All right, now also in understanding the history, we have to realize that this is, as far as we can tell, the post-Constantine era. Now let's just talk about Constantine a little bit. Constantine is famous because he legalized Christianity. Some people think that he made it the Roman religion. That wasn't him. That was later emperors. That wasn't Constantine. But he did make it legal, and he did kind of start the Roman Empire down that path. He legalized it in that it was not an illegal and illicit religion anymore. Instead, it was a religio illicita. It was legal to practice under Constantine. And he also made the Orthodox, which is basically another way of saying correct, the Orthodox Church tax exempt. And of course, having a religion that has a certain amount of favor, and other religions did get a certain amount of favor from time to time as well, but having a religion that had political favor tended to make the church institution itself more political. And of course, that eventually wound up kind of becoming the downfall of Christianity, especially in the Middle Ages. And that's where a lot of the change, not all of it, but a lot of the change was prompted. Constantine also allowed the church to use the Roman postal service free of charge, and that was a pretty big deal as well. A very kind gesture on his act. And a lot of these things that he did that was especially nice to the church was essentially by way of apology for all of the absolutely horrendous things the Romans had been doing to the church up until this point. And so part of it was due recompense, but the problem with some of the things that they did is that it gave the church a political power that it really didn't have before. And power tends to corrupt, and that's part of what happened in creating the traditional churches as we know them today. He also actively endorsed Christianity by ceremonially opening up their councils. Now, he didn't decide anything. You can read through all the material we have from the councils, and you'll see that Constantine and the things that he did participate in actually had very little effectual power, if any, but his public endorsements of Christianity probably paved the way for greater popularity of the religion. I think that would be certainly a justifiable claim. Another interesting thing is that he set aside money to repay Christians for their lost scriptures. That is, during the time of Roman persecution, not only were there lots of martyrs who died, but there was also lots of Christian scriptures that were burned. And, of course, these scriptures, whether they were written on papyri or whether they were written on vellum, whatever the case, they represented a very significant investment because it took a lot of time to make them. And of course the materials that they were written on were sometimes quite expensive, especially in the case of the vellum ones. And so these being burned, most of the ones that were burned would probably be papyri. But there's probably very few that would be the vellum ones that were burned. The vellum are more popular in the 4th century and afterwards, up until you get to the parchment in the Middle Ages. But a lot of these were burned, and so Constantine, basically by way of apology, sets aside money for the churches to go in and make more copies of their scriptures. He basically funds them because this is a very expensive thing to do. And that leads us into our next topic, the sloppy scribes that we have involved early on. That is, since the new church institution, that under the Roman peace, as it were, given peace from the Roman Empire, and they're saying, okay, it's legal now, we're not going to persecute you guys, the church comes into really a new light, and for the first time they don't really have to wash their backs as much, and so they get to participate in things, but they're still fairly new as a freed institution. And because of that, it's reasonable to assume that they didn't have many scriptoriums, that is, places to make books. And they also probably did not have many well-trained scribes of their own. And since this is the case, the early manuscripts that you get, especially in the 4th century, were sometimes pretty sloppy. And Codex Sinaiticus is actually a really good example of one of these fairly sloppy manuscripts. On the screen you have a part from Jeremiah chapter 38, verses 2 through 4a, that is through the first part of 4. And you'll see that it's actually down on the bottom of the page. It's not up in the main text where it's supposed to be. Somebody actually skipped over that, and then they had to put it back in afterwards. And this is where most of the corrections come from. That is, this scribes will accidentally forget stuff, and then you have to put it back in later. And these are usually the kinds of omissions that are made. Going on, and it wasn't just a few verses in Jeremiah. Here's an example from 2nd Esdras, which would more or less be Nehemiah and most Americans' Bibles today. Not quite the same, but similar enough for people to basically know where you are in the Bible. And you'll see that there's actually 9 different major corrections on the page that are put in the margins. And it's a good thing that these early books had wide margins, and they were somewhat intentionally made with wide margins so that corrections could be made as necessary. Transcription in a lot of ways was definitely more of an art in those days than it was a science. And it's actually very possible that the scribes who worked on Codex Sinaiticus and some of the other ones may have been, not necessarily were, but they may have actually been non-Christian. That is, in having money set aside for the Christians to make new copies of their scriptures, it may have been possible that some of the scribes that were hired were not actually Christian scribes. And if that's the case, it especially explains why some of these kinds of mistakes were made, because most people who are familiar with the text know the text wouldn't make these kinds of mistakes. These are sections that are just left out that are very obviously a part of the text, and most of the omissions occur in the Old Testament, which was presumably copied before you got to the New Testament. And so this is kind of a case of scribes learning as they go. And if it was Roman scribes who were more or less paid to do Christian transcription work, it's understandable that they would make lots of mistakes, and then the Christians would have to go back and correct it. Or it may simply have been Christian scribes at the time, and like I said, the Christians at that time really didn't have well-trained scribes of their own, so it basically would have been whoever was willing to undertake the venture, and they probably would have made lots of mistakes to start off with. So in either case, you wind up with very probably sincere people. If it was Roman scribes, they at least wanted to get their money out of it, and if it was Christian scribes, of course they wanted to do a good job. They just probably didn't know how to do it all that well, and they make lots of mistakes. That happens. So, as these initial scribes, there are probably 3 or 4 of them. Some people argue for more. I don't know too many people that would argue for less than 3, but there's a few people I think that argue for more. But most people would say around 3 or 4 scribes were really, really sloppy. They were. There's really no doubt about it. They left lots of stuff out. Because of that, the text had to be very meticulously corrected. And you can go through and you can find all sorts of corrections all over the place. And the question becomes, well, if it was such a bad copy, why on earth, why not just start new and get a new one? Well, like I said before, these things were very expensive. It's easily more than a year's wages to make one of these things. So you don't start over, you just make corrections. And because of that, Codex Sinaiticus is the most corrected manuscript of all the biblical manuscripts. It has a ton of corrections, 20,000 plus corrections in the margins. However, that said, in its corrected form, it coincides pretty well with the 130 plus Greek manuscripts that date to the 5th century or earlier. Now, below is basically the worst case I found in Codex Sinaiticus. I actually have a copy, and so I was thumbing through it looking for the largest correction that I could find, and I found Job chapter 16 verses 19 through chapter 17 verse 12. The scribe that was working on that page had just completely left it out, and of course it's very obvious that this is a mistake on the part of the scribe. This is not a case where it was omitted in the original manuscript and then the scribe has come back, hundreds of years later and decided that this needs to be put in or something like this. This is just a simple, very stupid kind of transcriptional mistake. Nothing really nefarious here. It's just a mistake. A pretty gross mistake in the sense of it being so large, but this is just the nature of the text. It's a very sloppy text, especially in the Old Testament. However, even though it is such a sloppy text, it really isn't necessarily a problem for people doing textual critical work with it, because most of these corrections, as far as we can tell, were made very near the time when the original writing was made, and so it's pretty easy to tell what was made soon and what was made later. That is, Greek, like all languages, as time goes on, the way that it's written will also change, and so we can pretty well tell between something that was written, say, 4th and 5th century, pretty close to the time where it's actually written, and something that was added, hundreds of years later, by a completely different hand. And it's pretty easy to do. So even though there's so many corrections, most of them are corrections that are pretty much immediate to the time in which it was written. Scribes made mistakes. People went through and they knew that mistakes were made, and so they went through and were very meticulous in correcting it, and they made corrections all over the place to make sure that this thing was as good as possible. And so in most places, actually pretty reliable. And the nice thing about it, like I said, is that we have many other manuscripts that date from the 5th century and earlier that support a Codex Sinaiticus and its generally corrected form, especially in the New Testament. Like I said, the New Testament is in much better shape than the Old Testament is. The Old Testament, there were lots of transcriptional mistakes that were made, but in the New Testament, there are relatively few and far between. Much greater care was taken in the New Testament, and that was probably because it was done later, so they got to practice with the Old Testament, or it was simply because they're just more meticulous with the New Testament. It's really hard to say exactly how all that happened. But one way or another, the form that it exists in now with the corrections is a pretty reliable form as far as we can tell, and that is an assessment that's made on the basis of comparison. It would definitely be problematic to say that any manuscript is accurate by dint of its own existence. That is, when you talk about textual criticism, what's reliable and what isn't, it is evidence that is supported that you want to go for. And Codex Sinaiticus, even though it itself represents a fairly sloppy transcription, it is supported by other manuscripts, and actually even other manuscripts that come before it, and ones that are much more careful, which show that the text form itself is actually very reliable. The scribes who that transcribed it from one manuscript into this new manuscript didn't do such a great job, but the text form itself is very well supported in the history. And so Sinaiticus does not stand alone, and because it doesn't stand alone, it can be used with these other ones to provide textual evidence. Alright, let's talk about the history a little bit more as to how we actually got it in the here and now. Well, it started with a guy named Constantine von Tischendorf, and he went to a place called St. Catherine's Monastery in the mid-1800s, and the first thing that he did was he gathered some of the Old Testament folios that he presumed were to be burned. And a folio is basically just a fancy name for one of the sheets. But he presumed that they were going to be burned, and so he rescued them from the flames, and that's the story he tells. Of course, the monastery tells a little bit different story. They they never claimed that they were going to burn any of it, and likely it was just a mistake on Tischendorf's part, because the folios were put in baskets, and a lot of the stuff that was put in the baskets would be taken out to be burned. But there's no evidence that they actually intended to burn any of this. And after Tischendorf made his initial discovery, more folios were discovered, and it became pretty obvious that the original codex, the full codex, had actually been dismantled, probably so that scribes could copy from it. And it's a lot easier to copy from individual folios than it is from the entire codex, because the entire codex is kind of cumbersome to open and transcribe across, because you usually wind up having to transcribe across another leaf that's in the way. So it's just easier to basically unbind it and do it leaf by leaf, page by page, essentially. Up here on the screen I have just a snapshot of the juncture between 1st and 2nd Peter, and as you can tell, it's actually fairly meticulous. And like I said, in the New Testament you don't see nearly as many corrections. There's one correction down there at the bottom, but it usually doesn't get much worse than this. There's relatively few corrections in the New Testament. Now, what does it look like? And let's talk about the prose first. Most of the folios, like I said, that's just a fancy name for a sheet, were written in 4 columns. Most of them were written in 4 columns using unsealed text. That's basically all capital letters. And it was also written from left to right, which is similar for all of us who speak English, but of course it'd be opposite to Hebrew, which reveals something fairly important in early Christian history, is that most of the early Christians didn't know a lot of the Hebrew, and that was because the common language at the time for Christians was Greek, and it read completely differently from the Hebrew did. Greek is from left to right, Hebrew is from right to left, and all sorts of issues that go on there. And it's really no wonder that the two groups wound up diverging so much, especially when you have fundamental differences like language. And this is from Hebrews, this particular shot is, and you'll see that there are very, very few corrections here. There's a few little ones here and there, but not anything on the order of like we saw in the Old Testament. Let's take a look at poetry. In choirs, that is sets of folios that present poetry, the material is written in 2 columns with indentations to assist oral reading, and the screenshot here is from Ecclesiastes. And so prose, 4 columns, poetry is generally in 2 columns. And it's just because of the way that it's read and the way that it's presented. And so actually finding your place in the poetry sections is actually a little bit easier, just because it's broken down a little bit more, which is nice. Alright, now another fairly important thing to know about what it looks like overall is what commentary it has to say on the canon of Scripture. Basically, what books does it contain? Now, it's incomplete in its Old Testament. It doesn't have everything that it could there. But this is what it does have. The screen shot here represents basically what we have today. And the Old Testament was arranged by genre, and this is very common with the Septuagint. And so the different genres that you have are the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then you have the historical books, and then you have the poetic prophets, and then you have the books of wisdom. And so those are the 4 genres in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, your genres are the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, Acts, the general epistles, and Revelation. And then you also have the ecclesiastical works like the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. Now you'll see that there's quite a bit of color on the screen, and that's because I tried to color code it to make things fairly obvious for people, but yeah, we'll see how that works. Anyways, I found certain things to be relatively interesting because of how they're placed. Things that are in red are not included in what we would call canonical scripture, which for Protestants is basically just our Bible. The things in red do not really show up in Protestant Bibles all that much, and some of them you can debate a little bit, and that's why they have multiple colors. The ones that are in purple, I've placed in purple just because it's interesting where they're placed, because that their placement differs a little bit from where they're typically placed now to where they were placed then. And then the ones in green are ones that are somewhat disputable as to their canonicity. So let's start more towards the beginning. So pretty much all Judeo-Christian groups, whether they be Jewish or Christian, will agree on the canonicity of the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those really are not debatable at all. Now, when you get into the historical section, on the other hand, you start getting into books that are debatable. Now, what's interesting is that with these codexes, they would be arranged by genre, like I said, and then within each genre, then you would have different classifications. That is, you would have canonical books, and then within each genre, after the canonical books, you would have the non-canonical books. And it's actually pretty easy to tell where these distinctions are, even without having read a whole lot of the Church Fathers. And the Church Fathers would usually distinguish between the canonical and the non-canonical pretty well, like Athanasius, for example, does this, Rufinus does this, Jerome does this, Cyril does this. There's a very clear distinction usually between canonical and non-canonical, but in these early codexes, they would usually put everything that was used, canonical and non-canonical. But there's usually a pretty easy way to tell. In the historical books, for example, all the books that are included in Codex Sinaiticus and the canonical series basically follow in chronological order. That is, the events in Joshua happened before the events in Judges, and Judges would be, of course, accompanied by Ruth. Then you get through, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. Now, those all together in the Septuagint would basically be called the reigns or the kings, or sometimes people will call them the kingdoms. And then you get the Chronicles in the Septuagint. They would be called basically the supplements. And then you get to First and Second Esdras, which is roughly equivalent to Ezra and Nehemiah in the Protestant canon. And those all follow along in chronological order. However, Esther does not. That is, the events in Esther happened before the events in Esdras. So if they considered Esther canonical, why didn't they put it in the historical order? Well, odds are they didn't consider it to be canonical. Neither did they consider Tobit, Judith, or the Maccabees to be canonical either. And this is well supported by church fathers such as Athanasius and Melito. Melito and Athanasius both leave Esther out of the canonical list. Athanasius does mention Esther, but he says that it's specifically non-canonical, just like Tobit and Judith. Melito just doesn't mention any of the non-canonical works whatsoever, so we're not exactly sure what his opinion on Esther was. But the order that it's placed in is a very easy giveaway that they didn't consider Esther to be canonical. And so that creates an interesting scenario for modern Protestants, and that modern Protestants do have Esther. We do have Esther in our Bibles. And it's more or less in the same position that you would find it in the Septuagint, and that we usually put it after Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, as to why it occurs in the Jewish canon is fairly obvious, in that Esther it basically gives the reason for why they celebrate the Feast of Purim. Why it shows up in a Christian canon and the Protestant canon is a little bit harder to explain. The easiest reason is that we Protestants basically just copied the Jewish canon, and that's basically how it got in there. But as far as early Christians are concerned, there seems to be a fairly consistent amount of disavowal of Esther as actually being canonical, which is interesting, and that's a very long discussion that people could have, but I won't get into that a whole lot, but it is interesting that is there. And then you have the poetic prophets, and there really isn't a whole lot of debate about that. We don't have Ezekiel in Codex Sinaiticus, we don't have Daniel, and we don't have every single one of the minor prophets. but we have enough to say that they probably contained all of them, and they're all probably considered canonical. There's no reason to believe that the poetic prophets wouldn't be considered canonical. Then you get into the wisdom books, and there you also have an interesting division as well. Now, the reason why I put these ones in purple here, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, is because it actually comes in a different order than they do in the Protestant canon. In the Protestant canon, we put the wisdom books before the poetic prophets. In Sinaiticus, though, they don't. And that actually has to do with actually the Jewish system of understanding what the prophets were. In the Jewish system, the prophets included both the historical prophets and the poetic prophets. The early Christians, though, separated them out based on genre, history versus prophecy. And so the non-canonical historical books wound up getting attached to the historical prophetic books, and things kind of got mishmashed from there. But they tried to keep all of the prophets pretty close to each other. However, the modern Protestant canon keeps basically the poetic books together and putting the wisdom books before the poetic prophets. And so that's kind of an interesting change. Also, in Sinaiticus, along with pretty much all of the other Septuagint texts, you don't have 150 psalms, you have 151 psalms, and that's because they add the non-canonical psalm from David. That is, that particular psalm actually says of itself that it's outside the number. But Christians tend to be fairly conservative, especially the early Christians, as to keeping things, and they'll just kind of keep anything around. And so they kept around the 151st psalm as well. And then you have the non-canonical wisdom books, Wisdom and Sirach, and then also, strangely, you have Job. Which is just really, really, really strange. There's usually not a whole lot of debate about the canonicity of Job, but there is definitely some indication, like Codex, Sinaiticus, that early Christians did have problems with it. And I don't think that the problems were necessarily on theological grounds, because you will read some of the early Christians who reference Job fairly often, and even very early on. For example, the work First Clement talks about Job and actually quotes from the book of Job. And it seems to do so regarding it as scripture. But not every generation necessarily felt the same about Job. One of the biggest problems with Job is that it is notoriously hard to translate both the Hebrew text and the Greek text, and probably for the same reason. That is, the forms of the Hebrew text, the earliest forms of the Hebrew text that we have, basically come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we found that they were written in a Paleo-Hebrew form. That is, a form that predates even the exile of the Jews, which makes it one of the most easy to verify books as to its authentic ancient date. It truly is an ancient book, and it was maintained in an ancient form for a long time. And given that most of the Septuagint was translated before the time of Christ, that means that they probably would have been working with this very old form of Job, and it would be something like translating something from Middle English into, say, Spanish for an English-speaking person. There's definitely going to be a disconnect. We could do modern English into Spanish pretty well if you know Spanish, but doing Middle English into Spanish is almost like having to learn 3 languages, or at least the 2 languages aside from your own first language. And so Job winds up being very hard, especially in Greek, to understand, because they were probably using the old Hebrew form, and Greek Job is actually really choppy. It's not very, very smooth at all. And so it probably got demoted in Codex Sinaiticus, not because of its content, but just simply because of the fact that most people probably would not have been able to understand it. It would have been relatively nonsensical. And then you get into the New Testament, and you have the typical order of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And most of the early church fathers would argue that this is the historical order, that Matthew was written first, and then Mark, and then Luke, and then John. And the early church fathers were pretty consistent on this. However, modern people have made the claim that Mark was actually written first, and it essentially just comes down to the fact that it's shorter, and people think that the gospel story developed as time went on, and so they put Mark first just because it's shorter, but there really is no external evidence to corroborate that. It's a very modern idea, and frankly a very secular idea. If we stick with the Christian records, then Matthew should go first. And then you have the Pauline epistles, and I highlighted Hebrews in purple because whoever put together Codex Sinaiticus very obviously thinks that Hebrews is a part of the Pauline epistles. It's sandwiched right between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and then the pastorals, that is 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And so whoever compiled this very obviously thought that Paul wrote Hebrews. And in fact, most of the early Christians, it's fair to say, probably did. It really wasn't until the 3rd century with Origen that really came under great debate. Now, that doesn't change its canonicity. It just means that people have been somewhat dubious about who exactly wrote it, but that doesn't mean that it didn't come from that time frame, and that it wasn't written at least by an ear witness of the apostles, if not a direct witness of Christ. And Paul technically would be an ear witness anyways, and that's all kind of a whole other discussion. But it is interesting that it is placed where it's placed. Another one that's interesting as far as placement is concerned is Acts, because in Codex Sinaiticus, Acts actually comes after the Pauline epistles. Why exactly this is, I mean, there's a fair amount of speculation, but it probably has more to do with the order of theology than it does necessarily history. That is, we usually put Acts with the Gospels because those are basically the historical portion of the New Testament. However, Codex Sinaiticus seems to be arranged more so in terms of theology. That is, Gospels are first in importance, and then the Pauline epistles are next, and then Acts, and then the general epistles, the Catholic epistles. And then Revelation would be last. And most of the early Christians were very consistent in putting Revelation last. And it's also a book that caused a lot of problems and lots of debates. And there was actually a time in the East where it was basically rejected. There were some Eastern Church Fathers that accepted it, but for a long time in the East, Revelation was not included in the canon of the New Testament. And that actually has a lot to do with the Montanists and their abuses of it, and some of those early controversies and heresies that sprung up. But by and large, they would still put Revelation at the end as being least in importance as far as theology is concerned. And frankly, I would agree with that. I think that it's very easy, especially in this modern age, to overemphasize Revelation. I'm not saying get rid of it or anything like that. I mean, it's still considered canonical, and even in Codex Sinaiticus it's canonical. But you have to be careful to keep things in their proper context. If you're given a choice on where to focus, I would definitely say it's wiser to focus on the Gospels than it is Revelation. I think that the order that it's arranged is very intentional, and that we can learn a lot from it. And then after all of the canonical New Testament works, you have the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. And like I said, the books in Codex Sinaiticus are arranged by genre, and also such that non-canonical works come after the canonical works. So you have the New Testament works, all of them being canonical, and then you have the non-canonical parts that are preserved by the Church, and that includes the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. Doesn't mean that they ever thought it was canonical, but they kept them because they felt that they were good for instruction. Alright, so let's talk about significance. One of the most important things about Codex Sinaiticus is that it is really good evidence against the high churches, and against the high church mentality. That is, Codex Sinaiticus, along with several other manuscripts, shows that the high churches had added portions to the text which were unknown to previous generations of Christians. That is, as time went on, Basically, the scriptures kept getting longer because the traditional churches, because of tradition, kept adding things to it. And by comparing manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus and the host of others that we have, it becomes pretty obvious that certain passages are not authentic, or at best extremely dubious, but most likely not authentic. For example, the long ending of the Lord's Prayer found in Matthew chapter 6, and it's the end of verse 13. Well, careful analysis of that has revealed that it has a lot of parallels with 1 Chronicles and chapter 29. I think it starts in verse 11. Can't remember for sure. But it seems like that long ending was actually taken from 1 Chronicles, so that the prayer that Jesus would pray would basically be a Davidic prayer. And that was probably done quite intentionally, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence to say that it was actually original. Most of the early manuscripts do not have it. Not just Codex Sinaiticus, there's others that omit it as well. And then there's also the famous long ending of Mark. And actually there are some medieval manuscripts that had said, oh, by the way, this, in a marginal note, had said, oh, by the way, this long part is from a fellow named Aristion, which was a late first century, early 2nd century Christian associated with Peter, who had tacked on a part after Mark had finished. And a lot of the early manuscripts were very careful to distinguish between it, or they just simply omitted it. And people often point out that, there's very few Greek manuscripts that actually omit the long ending, and that's true. But a lot of the early translations of the Greek text do omit it as well. In fact, altogether, there's actually about 100 manuscripts that omit the long ending of Mark. It's not just a few. There's actually a pretty large number. Another portion that is lacking in Codex Sinaiticus that is supported by other manuscripts is John 7:53 through 8:11. It's not just the fact that it's missing, or that any of these are missing in Codex Sinaiticus that reveals that the high church has added things. It's the fact that they're missing from this one, and there's other manuscripts that put them in as being dubious and being added, or in the case of John 7:53, 8:11, that is the woman caught in adultery, not only is it omitted in some and marked as dubious on others, you'll actually find it in completely different places sometimes. For example, some manuscripts will put it after Luke 21:38 or Luke 24:53, and some will put it in John, but in different places in John. That is, instead of being after John 7:52, it'll be actually after John 7:36. Or sometimes they'll put it all the way back up in chapter 21 and put it after chapter 21, verse 25. As to why on earth it would be in all these different places is really hard to tell. The most obvious answer is that it was something that was inserted afterwards, and different scribes basically disagreed about where to put it. That seems to be the most likely reason for why it shows up in all of these different places. And in fact, you actually can trace it through. It actually comes from the teaching in the constitutions of the apostles. That's where it's first mentioned in church history. People do not actually reference it as being a part of the Gospel of John until, I think it's somewhere in the 4th or 5th centuries. I think it's 4th century that you actually get people starting to mention it as being a part of the Gospel of John. Or maybe 5th century. I know that Chrysostom, he's a late 4th century guy, and he doesn't mention it as part of the Gospel of John. So it might be more so towards the 5th century that becomes a consistent teaching of the high churches, that the woman caught in adultery is a part of the Gospel of John. And then also you have the famous Comma Johanneum, that is in 1 John 5, 7, and 8. You look through the manuscript record, and that particular section is just not there before the first 14th century at the earliest. And all the evidence that we have points to actually being something that was hijacked from the Latin and then put into the Greek. There isn't any evidence that it existed in the Greek before the 14th century. That's how late of an edition it was. And it's basically a Latin edition. And 1 John 5, 7, and 8 is actually put up on the screen for you. and you can follow from the red to the blue the plate, and that basically represents the boundary where 1 John 5 7b through 8a should be if it was a part of the text, but as you can see, it's not there. And of course, the implication being that it was never there to be in the first place. And this is really significant in Codex Sinaiticus because, like I said, Codex Sinaiticus was corrected all over the place, and yet this never got corrected. The long ending of the Lord's Prayer never got corrected. The long ending of Mark never got corrected. The woman caught in adultery was never corrected. Why? Because they were never convinced that those were original. Lots of other things that were very obviously skipped over, they did put back in because they were skipped, but these were not skipped. These just simply weren't there. And even people who were correcting it sometimes hundreds of years later still didn't have access to it. You have to remember that Codex Sinaiticus was basically in use from the mid-4th century all the way up to the mid-19th century. It was a text that was in use for around 1,500 years, about a millennium and a half, and no one in all that time who had been looking at it deemed it necessary to put these in. They never considered them essential, and they never considered them authentic. For 1,500 years, that's a pretty good testimony as to historical corroboration. That is, all the things that it was compared to didn't seem to have it either, or it was probably marked as dubious in those things that it was compared to. So this is very strong evidence that these were not original at all. Now here's another thing that's just kind of a side instance, and this is talking about the Old Testament. Now most Protestants will use the Hebrew text for their Old Testament, and that is basically part of the Protestant tradition, if you will. That is, when we broke with Rome, we broke with the Latin Vulgates, and we also understood that the Septuagint, the Greek translation, was indeed a translation of the Hebrew, and so we decided to go with the form that was in the original language, which would be the Masoretic text. And on your screen, that would be the far right, the one labeled MT. That's the Masoretic text. That's the Hebrew version. However, most of the early Christians used the Septuagint, the LXX, and that's the lower left part of this diagram. And Codex Sinaiticus, Aleph, it's the weird X-looking one that's a part of the circle. You can see Alexandrinus and Vaticanus, those are A and B, along with Sinaiticus, all represents kind of a weird interbranching between the more Hebrew side, you might say, the form that's more closely related to the Masoretic text that the Protestants use, and the Septuagint as it was used a lot by the early Christians. That is Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus represent kind of a blending of the Hebrew text and the Greek texts, which actually is pretty well in keeping with Christian tradition overall, and that the New Testament actually blends between the two as well. That is, there are places in the New Testament which definitively are referencing the Hebrew text, and there's also a great number of places that are definitively representing the Greek text. And so it makes sense that the early Christians would basically use a combined form of the text. And this is actually what a lot of modern translations are going to, is a combined form of the text. Because they find places where the Masoretic text doesn't seem to have an authentic reading, and where the Septuagint doesn't seem to have authentic readings, and so they wind up using a blended form, using the best evidence for each one that they have available. That's a principle that we have now, and evidently it was a principle all the way back then. Not necessarily that they would agree on everything, but that basic principle of using all of the text types that are out there in all the different languages definitely seems to hold. And I find that quite exceptionally interesting. All right, so next slide. Another matter of significance is the genealogy debate. That is Christ's genealogy. And this is a very old debate for Christians, very old. What is interesting about Codex Sinaiticus is that in the Gospel of Luke, it records 77 generations from Adam to Christ. The traditional form that you find in the Textus Receptus, the later text type that developed more so in the Middle Ages, more or less prior to the Renaissance, had the number of generations at 76, and this number was known to fairly early church fathers such as Augustine. Augustine is more or less a 5th century church father. He was alive in the 4th century too, but a lot of his writings come from the 5th century. Now, what makes this even more strange is, of course, you have this codex that says 77, the traditional text says 76, but ironically, early church fathers such as Irenaeus, and he's a 2nd century guy, said that there were only 72 generations from Adam to Christ. And that just creates all kinds of angst for people who are trying to figure this out, because you basically have 3 different numbers. And the question is, who on earth is right, and how on earth does all this work out? Well, there is a way to harmonize all of these, but in order to do that, you have to understand a little bit about the context that Luke is writing into, and that is that with numbers, you could usually oftentimes make a symbolic case as well as representing an actual fact. A good counterpoint for this is actually the genealogy that occurs in Matthew. Matthew's genealogy is actually a truncated genealogy. If you compare the genealogy that Matthew gives with 1 Chronicles, you'll see that Matthew actually leaves some names out. Why does Matthew do that? Well, Matthew is trying to make the point that there are 14 generations in each one of these important time periods. 14, 14, 14, and why he's doing that is because 14 is the number that would be associated with David. And it was kind of David's number, the number that went along with his name. And it has to do with gematria and number associations with letters. Each letter would represent a number, and you add them up and you get the overall number. And for David, it turns out that it's 14. And so Matthew was making the point that Jesus is the Messiah, he's the Christ, he's the anointed one that's coming in the manner of King David, who was also the anointed one. And so Matthew is emphasizing the messiahship of Christ by reiterating this number 14. He didn't literally mean that there were 14 generations, because that's obviously not the case. You can just look at First Chronicles. He's trying to make a symbolic argument for his readers. And it's very likely that Luke was doing the exact same thing. The early manuscripts record 77 generations, which of course has the significance of being perfection upon perfection. 7 and 7, 77, trying to say that Christ was this perfect perfection. He was the perfection of God's plan, and he was also the perfection of man. Man had fallen into sin, and Christ perfected man. And so there's a symbolic argument that's going on here. But the question becomes, how on earth did Irenaeus get 72 generations out of that argument? Well, that would be the only way that you would be able to make that argument is if you knew which ones had been added. In the case of Matthew, you're saying which ones have been dropped, and you're comparing it to First Chronicles for that. In the case of Luke, you're saying which ones have been added in, and there's also some comparisons for that. For example, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew text, you do not have Canaan again. But Canaan shows up twice in Luke's genealogy. That's probably because he's adding in an extra person to get to 77. And it seems that later Christian scribes changed Genesis to match what Luke had said, not realizing that Luke was doing that intentionally so that people would know that Canaan was added. Now that's, of course, speculative, because we don't actually have a whole lot of manuscript evidence for the book of Genesis in Greek, and so it's hard to say exactly what happened there. I admit that that's more or less speculative. But if we're going to get to Irenaeus' number, we're going to have to take out 5 of the names. And Canaan, just because it doesn't show up in the other manuscript record, is a pretty likely candidate for it. And then also with Ram, which in Luke would be Arni, right after that you have Admin. And Arni is being traded out for a ram or a ram. It's a textual name, and so Luke is kind of highlighting for the reader that, hey, something funny is going to happen next. And basically what has happened is the admin has been added in. And admin is also one that you will not find in the other chronologies in the Old Testament, at least as far as I know. And I'm going to compare it to the Septuagint, just because if something is likely to include extra things, the Septuagint is more likely to include the extra things. And so this would be after Abraham. And so that would actually probably be in Ruth that I should be looking at. Sorry, folks. I just can't remember if admin is in the list or not. And so you're going to get to play around with me as I look through it. Okay, so after Hezron, we have Aran, and then Aminadab. So no, the other manuscripts do not include admin, and so he is one that Luke probably added for symbolic purposes. And then down towards the end of the genealogy in Luke, you have Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, and Resa being repeated. And Resa is a name that implies leadership or prince-ship, and so that would describe Zerubbabel. He's a very important figure in Jewish history, a great leader who was the son of Shealtiel. So the son of Shealtiel, who was Resa, who was a prince, is kind of the extra long, flowery kind of titling is also probably evidence that Luke was giving to his reader to say, hey, by the way, this person actually isn't in the genealogy. It's being put in for symbolic purposes. And so if you take out these three, Resa, Zerubbabel, Shealtiel, Admin, and the extra Canaan, then you get to Irenaeus's 72 literal generations, Luke's symbolic 77, and understanding that the Arni and Admin were combined later on because it didn't show up in the Septuagint. It was harmonized with the Old Testament, explains how the traditional number got to be 76. And which is an interesting little history, and it's fun to trace through, but most people aren't going to care, and I probably didn't need to go into all that detail, but that's kind of the conversation on that. And I won't get into extra detail on that one. So in conclusion, I hope that you have enjoyed learning about Codex Sinaiticus. And yeah, some portions of this definitely do challenge our traditional views. That is, some people like to believe that the Bible has been perfectly preserved in every component, and well, that just simply isn't true. Sometimes scribes did make mistakes. The fortunate thing about it, though, is that those scribes aren't the only ones who wrote, and so we can compare and contrast all of the different evidence that we have and be able to come to the best conclusion regarding what Scripture actually has to say. And so what this text like this do for us is that they reinforce our position against the high church, as against the high churches for us as low church Christians, and being able to say that there is external evidence to corroborate what Christianity is all about for those who care to pick through the history and actually figure out what's going on. And now that implies a certain amount of study and a certain amount of culpability, but it's definitely possible to get there, and Codex Sinaiticus is one of the ones that allow us to do that. So I thank you for your time, and I hope that was instructive, if nothing else. And I know it's definitely a bit rambly and kind of all over the place, but like I said, it's mostly just for general information, and I think that it at least accomplished that goal. So go with God and be blessed.